70%. That's roughly how much of the honey sold in American grocery stores has been stripped of the one thing that actually proves it's honey. Not a little diluted, not slightly processed. Stripped, filtered, blended, and in some cases mixed with cheap syrup until almost nothing bee-made is left in the bottle. And here's the part that should genuinely bother you. The worst offender on this list is very likely sitting in your kitchen right now. Not some obscure store brand nobody's heard of. One of the best-selling honeys in the entire country, a brand you've probably trusted for years without giving it a second thought. I'm going to show you exactly which one it is. And by the end of this list, you're going to want to go check your own pantry. Here's how this is going to work. We're counting down 10 honey brands that have shown up again and again in independent lab testing, court filings, and food safety investigations, starting with the cheapest, most obvious offenders, and working our way up to the brand that's probably in more American kitchens than any other honey on earth. Then I'll hand you 3 brands that consistently test as the real thing, plus 2 60-second checks you can run tonight, right at your kitchen counter, with nothing more than a glass of water. Let's start at the bottom of the shelf. Number 10. The cheapest bottle in the store. Walmart's Great Value Honey. And the price alone should raise an eyebrow. Because real honey is expensive to make, there's no way around that. Bees have to visit roughly 2 million individual flowers just to produce a single pound of the stuff. A hive only gives up so much honey in a season, no matter how well it's managed. So when a bottle costs less per ounce than a bag of apples at the same store, the math simply doesn't work unless something was cut somewhere along the way. Store-brand honey like this typically comes from what's called the global commodity trade, a system where massive contract packers blend honey pulled from a dozen different countries into one uniform product, then heat it and force it through fine filters until every bottle looks identical, season after season. Independent testing has repeatedly found honey in this category, with little to no detectable pollen inside it. And pollen isn't just a random particle floating in the jar, it's the only real fingerprint honey has. No pollen means no way to trace which country, which region, or even which continent that honey actually came from. You're not necessarily buying something dangerous here. You're buying a mystery blend with a reassuring word printed on top of it. Number 9. The store you've shopped at for 20 years. Kroger isn't a discount warehouse chasing rock-bottom prices. It's the grocery store in your actual neighborhood, the one that feels local even though it's one of the largest supermarket chains in the entire country. And that familiarity is exactly why this one lands harder than the last one did. Kroger's private label honey is sourced almost exactly the same way Walmart's is, through contract packers, whose names never actually appear anywhere on the bottle. The supplier feeding that bottle can change from one shipment to the next without a single word on the label changing with it. The country of origin can shift too, which means the jar you bought back in the spring might share almost nothing in common with the jar you pick up in the fall, aside from the logo on the front. If you're the kind of person who actually wants to know what's really in your kitchen before it ends up on your family's table, instead of just trusting the label and hoping for the best, that's genuinely who this channel is built for. We go after the everyday stuff most people never stop to question. And if that's useful to you, staying subscribed just means you won't miss it the next time we tear one of these apart. Number 8. The Pharmacy Honey Bear. CVS, Walgreens, that regional drugstore chain near your house. Grab one of those little plastic honey bears off the shelf because it's cheap and convenient, and you've unknowingly bought into one of the worst testing categories on this entire list. Independent pollen testing has repeatedly found pharmacy brand honey with 0 detectable pollen. Not reduced. Not partial. 0. These generic house brands carry no real name recognition and no brand reputation worth protecting, which means there's very little financial incentive for anyone in that supply chain to spend extra money on verified, traceable sourcing. Nobody's necessarily trying to poison you here. It's simpler and, honestly, a little more depressing than that. When there's no loyalty on the line, and no reputation to lose, there's no real reason to pay for the genuine article when a cheap syrup blend tastes close enough that almost nobody notices the difference. Number 7. The bulk tub from the Warehouse Club. This is where the stakes actually start climbing, because you're no longer buying a single jar. You're buying pounds of the stuff at once, feeding it to more people, spreading it across more months, mixing it into more meals than almost any other honey purchase you'll ever make. Warehouse Club private labels have faced the exact same scrutiny as the smaller store brands we've already covered. Heavy filtration, no traceable pollen whatsoever, and an origin story that nobody outside the company can actually verify. A familiar, well-trusted name stamped across the side of a massive plastic container doesn't automatically mean someone at corporate personally vetted the supply chain behind it. Sometimes, it just means a lot more households are unknowingly buying the exact same unverified blend. Only now, it's coming in a much bigger jug. Number 6. The one with a name built entirely to sound trustworthy. There's a brand out there simply called American Choice. And notice what that name is already doing to you before you've even read a single ingredient on the back. It sounds like a decision someone made on your behalf. A value. Something your grandfather might have picked up without thinking twice about it. That feeling, that sense of quiet, patriotic trust, is essentially the entire product being sold to you. Pollen filtration testing on this honey has come back the same way as almost everything else we've covered so far. No pollen detected at all, which means there's genuinely no way to confirm that the American part of that name means anything real. A reassuring name costs a company absolutely nothing to print on a label. A verified, traceable domestic supply chain costs real money, real infrastructure, and real oversight. The jar in front of you tells you, pretty clearly, which one this particular brand actually decided to pay for. Number 5. The one with the prettiest packaging in the entire store. Target's Archer Farms honey looks like something you'd find at a specialty food shop. Warm, considered typography, minimalist design. Exactly the kind of jar people photograph for a kitchen flat lay without thinking twice about what's actually inside it. That feeling of quality and intention is, itself, the product being sold here. It has very little to do with what's actually in the jar. Archer Farms honey, including its organic variety, has shown up repeatedly on documented pollen filtration test lists, with the exact same result as the cheapest. Bargain bin honey on this list stripped, untraceable, origin completely unknown. And here's who this one really stings the hardest. People who deliberately walked away from Walmart and Kroger specifically because they'd read somewhere that store brands cut corners on quality. They paid more at Target specifically to avoid this exact problem. And by every available test, they ended up with it anyway, just wrapped in a much nicer looking jar. Number 4. The one sitting proudly in the health food aisle. Whole Foods 365 Organic Honey. Whole Foods has spent decades building its entire brand identity around clean, premium, trustworthy food. And yet this particular honey is priced only a few cents more per ounce than Walmart's. Now you know exactly why. The 365 Organic Wildflower Honey has been put through the same intense heating and filtration process as the cheapest store brands on this list, stripped of its pollen, its natural enzymes, and much of its nutritional value right alongside them. And here's the detail that should genuinely bother you more than anything else in this section. The word organic doesn't mean unfiltered. It doesn't mean raw. It doesn't even guarantee traceability. The USDA doesn't certify organic honey with the same rigor it applies to organic produce, which means a bottle can be completely, legally organic and still be almost entirely stripped of what actually makes honey worth buying in the first place. Number 3. The name that's carried over 100 years of trust. You already know this one. The Little Bee, smiling on the label. The name that sounds like a genuine farming cooperative, like beekeepers in flannel shirts pulling frames out of hives on a quiet Tuesday morning somewhere in the Midwest. Sue Bee has sat in American kitchens for generations, and that deep, inherited trust is exactly why it earned a spot on this list. Sue Bee was directly named in the 2023 wave of class action lawsuits, the same legal filings that also caught Costco and Nature Nates, with plaintiffs alleging the honey had been diluted with corn syrup, rice syrup, and beet sugar, and that its pollen had been removed to the point where the true origin couldn't be traced at all anymore. 100 years of a smiling little bee stamped onto a label doesn't automatically mean 100 years of honest honey sitting underneath it. One thing I genuinely find interesting every time we put one of these together, the comments always fill up with people from completely different corners of the world, checking the exact same brands, sitting in their own kitchens, right? Now, so if you've got a second, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. I read every single one of those, and it's one of my favorite parts of doing this. Number 2. The one made specifically for your kids. Every child on Earth practically knows Winnie the Pooh, the round little bear with his head permanently stuck inside a honey pot. Arguably the most famous honey lover in the history of children's media. So when a parent spots that character sitting on a jar in the store, something happens almost instantly. The guard drops. It feels innocent. It feels like the obviously safe choice for a child, almost by default, without a second thought given to it. Honey Tree Incorporated actually makes this honey and sells it through Walmart, and when Food Safety News had it independently tested in a lab, the pollen came back completely gone, not partially filtered down, gone entirely. When investigators pressed the manufacturer on why, the company's answer was straightforward. American shoppers simply prefer their honey crystal clear. Crystal clear requires exactly the kind of aggressive ultrafiltration that strips out every last trace of where that honey actually came from. And kids are smaller than adults. Their bodies process everything they eat at a much higher relative concentration than yours do. What you stir into their warm milk when they're sick, or drizzle across their toast on an ordinary Tuesday morning, should genuinely be exactly what the label says it is. The bear on that jar is fictional. The missing pollen underneath it is not. And now, number 1. The brand you almost certainly have sitting in your kitchen cabinet right this second. 1 out of every 10 bottles of honey sold anywhere in America comes from this single brand. Nature. Nate's 100% pure raw honey. It also controls close to half of the entire organic honey market in the United States, all on its own. Which is exactly what makes this particular reveal so hard to sit with. It turns out that 100% pure raw honey, printed boldly right across the front of the bottle in big confident letters, is neither 100% honey nor genuinely raw. Nature. Nate's heats its honey to roughly 120 degrees Fahrenheit specifically, so it pours more smoothly and looks more appealing on a shelf. But the enzymes inside honey actually start breaking down at somewhere around 105 degrees. Lab testing conducted as part of a 2019 lawsuit found added syrups mixed into the product, and notably, the company's own legal response never actually denied those specific contamination claims. Then, roughly 2 years ago, the Orthodox Union pulled the brand's kosher certification entirely. Not raw, not fully honey, according to independent testing. Not even kosher anymore, according to the very organization that used to certify it. And it is, statistically speaking, very likely the exact bottle sitting in your own kitchen cabinet right now, simply because it's the best-selling honey brand in the entire country. So that's the full list. 10 brands, top to bottom, and by now there's a genuinely good chance you've spotted at least one sitting on your own shelf. Before we get into the honey that actually passes every single one of these tests, here are 2 checks you can run tonight, right at your own kitchen counter, using things you almost certainly already own. The water test. Fill an ordinary glass with cold water. Spoon in a small amount of honey, and this part matters. Don't stir it. Real honey sinks slowly and holds itself together in a dense little lump at the bottom of the glass. Fake honey, the kind that's been cut with corn syrup or rice syrup, spreads outward and clouds the water almost instantly because those added sugars dissolve the second they make contact with liquid. 60 seconds. That's genuinely the entire test, and you can do it with honey you already own tonight. The crystallization test. This one takes considerably longer to play out, but it might be the single most reliable sign there is. Real, raw honey crystallizes naturally. Over time, it turns thick, grainy, sometimes almost solid, especially once it's been sitting somewhere cool for a few months. That is not spoilage, and it's not a defect. That's simply chemistry doing exactly what it's supposed to do to an unprocessed product. So if a jar has been sitting untouched in your cabinet for a year or two, and it's still perfectly clear, still pouring smoothly like syrup straight out of the bottle, that's not actually a sign of quality, no matter how convenient it feels. That's usually a strong sign it's been heavily processed specifically, so it never does what real honey is naturally supposed to do on its own. Now, finally the honey that actually earns your trust. Number 1. Local hive honey. Every single jar carries something called a True Source certification, and critically, it's independently audited, rather than self-awarded by the company producing it, meaning an outside third party actually verified where that honey genuinely came from, rather than just taking the manufacturer's word for it. It's raw, unfiltered, and sold in distinct regional varieties, which means the honey sourced from the Pacific Northwest genuinely tastes noticeably different from honey sourced out of the Southeast, simply because different bees were visiting different flowers to make each batch. That kind of natural, unpredictable variation from jar to jar is exactly the sort of thing you want to see on a shelf. It does cost more than the bargain brands we've already gone through. That's precisely because the certification and the supply chain sitting behind it actually cost something real to maintain. Number 2. YS Organic Eco Bee Farms. This was the very first bee farm in North America to earn organic certification, and remarkably, it's used essentially the same production process for roughly 3 decades now without cutting corners along the way. It's genuinely unfiltered and unpasteurized, which means you'll actually watch it crystallize inside the jar over time, right in your own cabinet proof, honestly, that it's working exactly the way it's supposed to. If you want it pourable again after it crystallizes, just set the jar inside a bowl of warm water for a few minutes. Skip the microwave entirely if you can help it. The same intense heat that makes commercial honey shelf-stable and pourable for years is the exact same heat that destroys the enzymes you were trying to preserve by buying raw honey in the first place. And finally, number 3. Honey from a local beekeeper. This single option genuinely beats every certification, every lab test, and every carefully worded label claim we've talked about throughout this entire video, for one simple, almost obvious reason: there's no long, complicated supply chain left for fraud to hide inside anywhere. Find a small local apiary or a beekeeper selling at your nearest farmer's market, and you can ask them directly, face to face, exactly where their hives sit, how the honey was actually harvested, and whether it was ever heated or filtered at all during the process. Hive to jar, straight to your kitchen table. There's simply no room left in a journey that's short for laundering, dilution, or mystery syrup to sneak in anywhere along the way. It's just honey, made the way it's been made for thousands of years, long before any of this got quite this complicated. If today's list changed the way you're going to look at that jar sitting in your own cabinet tonight, that's genuinely the entire reason we put these together: practical, useful information you can actually act on the next time you're standing in an aisle deciding what ends up on your family's table. If that's the kind of channel you want in your corner going forward, I'd honestly love to have you subscribe and stick around, because we go after something exactly like this almost every single week. And if you haven't already, let me know down in the comments where you're watching from today. I still read every one of them, and I always will. You reached for that jar today probably assuming honey was the one food in your entire kitchen too simple to fake. One ingredient: bees, a hive, a beekeeper, a jar. That's the whole story, or at least it's supposed to be. But for a lot of what's actually sitting on American shelves right now, that story quietly stopped being true a long time ago. And the label sitting on the front of that bottle was never, ever going to be the thing that told you